Hebraic typology connects prophets. Events from the life of one prophet are placed into the life of a subsequent prophet. And this shows that there is a divine pattern established by God connecting his prophets to one another.
The Gospels actually show how we can decipher for ourselves this hidden code or typology that was used to create the Jesus story.
At the very beginning of the Gospels, there's a primer of this typology. What the author of Matthew has done is take events from the Old Testament and place them into the life of Jesus. These events occur in the same sequence in the story of Jesus as they occur in the Old Testament.
Numerous Bible scholars had already identified the following parallels.
Both stories have a patriarch named Joseph who travels from Israel to Egypt, a ruler who massacres innocent boys, a divine character who states that all the men are dead who sought your life, and then a return from Egypt to Israel. This is followed by events which have passing through water. In the Old Testament, the Israelites pass through the Red Sea. In Matthew, Jesus is given a baptism in which he passes through water. We then travel into the wilderness. The Israelites are in the wilderness for 40 years. Jesus goes into the wilderness for 40 days. Finally, we have the three temptations. In the Old Testament, we have the temptation by bread, the statement, do not tempt God, and the commandment to worship only God. These appear again in Matthew, where Jesus is tempted by bread, tells the devil, do not tempt God, and instructs him to worship only God. Therefore, when you compare the life of Jesus with the life of Moses, you see a linkage that shows that the character in the Gospels was divinely connected to the character in the Old Testament. The life of the first Savior of Israel, Moses, foresaw the life of Jesus, who's now claiming to be the next Savior of Israel.
To understand the rest of the Jesus story, his adult ministry, we simply need to know that the same system of parallel names, locations, and concepts occurring in the same sequence was used to connect Jesus in the Gospels to Titus in the works of Josephus. Our scholars explain this gospel typology in the following three examples.
Jesus comes to the Sea of Galilee at the beginning of his ministry. He gathers his disciples to him and he says, do not be afraid, follow me and become fishers of men. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus actually says catchers of men. Titus comes to the same location, to the Sea of Galilee. He gathers his troops, his disciples, together and he says, don't be afraid. And then he leads them. They follow him and they attack a group of Jewish rebels. They sink the Jews' boats. The Jews attempt to swim to safety, and the Romans use their spears to catch them. They become fishers of men.
The match isn't exact, but we should never expect it to be exact. It's simply a type which is repeated across the whole of the New Testament.
Jesus is constantly dealing with devils. Josephus also deals with devils, but Josephus defines who these devils are. He states that the devils are those individuals who have a rebellious spirit and rebel against Rome. At Gadara, Jesus encounters one man who has a legion of demons inside his mind. They then are driven out by Jesus. They infect a herd of swine, and then this herd rushes wildly into the water. This is a parallel to Titus's battle at Gadara. where one individual infects an entire legion of Jews with his demonic spirit, and then that group in turn infects another group, and this combined group is driven by the Romans into the sea.
What's being suggested here is that this story that you find in the Gospels is in some ways sort of like a grim parable about that military event. It's sort of like a bit tongue-in-cheek, I think. The Romans had a vicious sense of humour like this, a very black sense of humour. In a medieval text that I've studied, which is called the Gospel of Barnabas, when you read that story, the way it's presented is in an unsophisticated form, that is to say it's sort of been decoded in some ways, and it becomes clear that what we're talking about here are the Jewish rebels are chased into the sea and they drown in the sea. In the Gospels, these are presented as pigs. This is once again a very dark, black sort of Roman sense of humour. Some of this literature really needs to be understood like that.
In Josephus's biography, he describes when he was in the entourage of Titus during the closing stages of the siege of Jerusalem, he chanced upon 3 of his friends who were being crucified. And he pleaded with Titus for their release. And Titus gave that permission, and the 3 figures were removed from the cross. 2 of them died, and 1 revived. Now, if you're looking for a stereotypic example of how some idea was floated into the mind of someone writing the Gospels, that is a pretty clear example. It's certainly a strange occurrence that we find such an incident in the works of Josephus when it shows up in such a dramatic form in the Gospels.
In the Gospels, Joseph of Arimathea asked the Roman commander to take Jesus down from the cross. In Josephus's history, Joseph Bar Matthias asked the Roman commander to take someone down from the cross. Arimathea is a pun on Josephus's last name, Bar Matthias.